Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is electronic invoicing in Saudi Arabia for Dynamics 365 Commerce. My name is Anthony, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. The session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. When you join this event, your name, email address, and/or phone number may be viewable by other session participants in the attendee list. By joining, you're agreeing to this experience. The recording will be available on the TechTalk's Community Dynamics page within the coming weeks. If you have questions for the presenter or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters are responding to your questions during the session and in a live segment after the presentation. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Principal Product Manager Evgeny Popov and Principal PM Manager Marek Rolecki on board for the Q&A panel. Over to you, Evgeny.
Thank you, Anthony. Hello, everybody. My name is Evgeny Popov, and I'm a Principal Product Manager in the Dynamics 365 product team that is responsible for the localization of Dynamics 365 finance and operations applications. So basically, this means we are adapting those applications to local regulatory requirements in many countries or regions worldwide. And I'm mainly responsible for the localization of the Dynamics 365 Commerce application. And together with me today here is Marek Rolecki, who is the product manager lead that is responsible for the overall electronic invoicing area in our localization team. Today we will be talking about the electronic invoicing implementation for Saudi Arabia, and we will be specifically talking about how the electronic invoicing requirements are supported in Dynamics 365 Commerce. So before we proceed, this is just our regular disclaimer slide. So please look through it. We are presenting the product and the current state of the product as is, and we make no guarantees that there will be no changes in the future. So please take what is presented as is for this moment. Okay, so our today's agenda will be as following. We will briefly talk about electronic invoicing requirements for Saudi Arabia in general, and then we'll focus on commerce, on how the requirements are implemented and supported in commerce. There will be a couple of demos during this presentation, and before I begin, I encourage you to review other recordings from TechTalk sessions dedicated to electronic invoicing that were held during this calendar year. So we had multiple electronic invoicing sessions for the functionality in general, and also for the implementation of the electronic invoicing for Saudi Arabia in Dynamics 365 Finance. So I will not be describing in details how electronic invoicing works or supported in Dynamics 365 Finance, and we'll mostly focus on commerce, as I said. I will only touch this on a very high level, so please review those recordings, and please also take advantage of the great documentation that we have on the learn.microsoft.com portal dedicated to electronic invoicing. So just a really high-level discussion on the electronic invoicing scope for Saudi Arabia. So the electronic invoicing requirements in Saudi Arabia were announced in 2020, and the requirements are being enforced in 2 phases. The first phase started last December, and it introduced quite simple requirements on the generation of electronic invoicing for business-to-business transactions, and on printing QR codes in invoices for business-to-consumer transactions. Right. The phase 2 will be enforced from the 1st of January of 2023, and this phase brings already much more complex requirements of the generation and submission of electronic invoicing, of clearance of electronic invoicing, and so on. And the requirements basically may be split into 2 areas. The first area covers business-to-business or business-to-government transactions. And here we have a so-called clearance model when the supplier that sells some goods to their customer is obliged to generate an electronic invoice. And in this case, it's called a tax e-invoice. And this tax e-invoice should be sent to the tax authorities for clearance through their portal. Basically, the authorities verify the e-invoice for completeness and consistency, and return the clearance to the supplier. And only after the e-invoice is cleared, it can be stored and shared with the customer. Right, but this submission of electronic invoicing can happen in a kind of a deferred manner, so not immediately after the invoice is issued by the supplier, but maybe during some stated period of time. Right. In contrast to that, in the business-to-consumer area, the so-called reporting model is enforced, where a supplier that sells some goods to a consumer is required to generate and print, to issue and print an invoice, so-called simplified invoice in this case, immediately upon completing the sales transaction. And this invoice must be, as I said, printed and passed to the consumer. And also this invoice needs to have a QR code printed in it, and this QR code basically should contain the information about this invoice, some data from this invoice, and also the hash of this invoice, right? And this means that the supplier has to generate the electronic invoice immediately, right? Hash it, create a QR code, and print the simplified invoice and give it to the consumer. And after that, the supplier can store the electronic invoice and submit it to the government through the authorities portal. And later, the consumer can verify their printed invoice using the QR code and an application from the government. So the major difference in the B2C case is that the electronic invoice needs to be generated immediately upon completing a sale, right? And a QR code needs to be printed immediately that contains the information or some data from this electronic invoice, right? But on the other hand, there is no requirement for clearance. So the supplier doesn't need to get a clearance from authorities in order to issue the electronic invoice. So let's see how this is supported in Dynamics 365. So when talking about regular tax invoices, B2B invoices that are issued from Dynamics 365 Finance, so we support issuing and submitting e-invoices for such sales invoices or customer invoices using, we support it with the so-called electronic invoicing service which is a recent Microsoft offering. It's a part of Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations applications, and this service basically handles all electronic invoicing requirements of various countries and regions worldwide. So when a sales invoice or credit note or debit note is issued from Dynamics 365 Finance, its data is submitted to the electronic invoicing service, where it is converted into the form of a tax e-invoice. And then this tax e-invoice is submitted to authorities. And when the clearance is received for this tax e-invoice, this clearance also contains the QR code for this e-invoice, and this data is sent back to Dynamics 365 Finance, and then the invoice can be printed with this QR code, etc. Right. So in contrast to that, in case of Dynamics 365 Commerce, as I said, we need to generate a simplified e-invoice immediately upon completing the sales transactions in POS. So due to this, we generate the e-invoice, the XML file of a simplified e-invoice on the commerce channel side immediately after concluding the retail sales transactions in POS, right? So we also generate a QR code for this, and we print this QR code in the receipt that is printed for the sales transaction in POS, right? And we save the simplified e-invoice in the XML format, and also the QR code in some special data model together with the retail transaction or linked to the retail transaction. And the simplified e-invoice data, basically the XML and the hash code and everything else, is uploaded to Commerce headquarters using regular data sync jobs like CDX jobs. All right, and in Commerce headquarters, we have retail transactions and simplified e-invoices linked to them. And then we can submit those simplified e-invoices to authorities, again, using the electronic invoicing service. But in this case, the electronic invoicing service doesn't need to generate the e-invoice because it has already been generated, right? But it just kind of forwards or reports the XML file, the simplified e-invoice, to authorities, right? And receives back just a confirmation that the invoice is correct or not, right? So that's basically the difference in how the electronic invoicing looks like in commerce as compared to finance. Okay, so let's talk about how the electronic invoicing generation looks like in Dynamics 365 Commerce. To generate electronic invoices on the commerce channel side, we use a so-called fiscal integration functionality that exists in Dynamics 365 Commerce. So fiscal integration functionality, or a fiscal integration framework, this is how we call it, is a core commerce functionality that supports implementing various fiscal registration requirements that exist in many countries or regions worldwide, right? And just fiscal registration, when speaking about fiscal registration, this is a registration of retail sales in the way in the form that is required by local fiscal regulations that exist in various countries. And these regulations may come in very different forms. These requirements may come in very different forms. For example, in some countries, it is required to register a retail sale immediately in a device named fiscal printer and print a so-called fiscal receipt. In other countries, there are also some fiscal devices, but with no printing capabilities, some like only storing capabilities, right? In some other countries, it is required to register retail sales with some online web services provided by local tax authorities, and also one of the approaches is so-called digital signing of retail transactions, where it's not required to send the retail transaction data anywhere, but you need to digitally sign the retail transaction data and store the signature, so that later, if authorities want to validate your retail sales data, they can use the signature to validate the consistency of the data, right? So all these measures are actually aimed to prevent like modification or manipulation with the retail sales data, and in general are aimed to fight tax fraud in the retail industry. So going back to Saudi Arabia, here, like fiscal registration requirements. So we kind of treat the electronic invoicing requirements as fiscal registration requirements in retail, and they come in the form of digital signing, because we need to generate some fiscal document, such as the simplified electronic invoice. Then we need to hash it, hash some data from this invoice, and then we need to digitally sign it. Right, and also it's important that when we generate the hash of a simplified e-invoice, we need to include into the data of this invoice the hash of the previous simplified invoice generated on the same point of sale, thus creating a kind of a chain of signed electronic invoices. This makes modifying or manipulating with the data of retail sales even more complex, or even maybe impossible, right? Because if you want to change a data and a signature of one electronic invoice, you probably will have to change the data and the signatures of all electronic invoicing that were issued after that. Right, so this is basically very complex or even impossible, right? So we use our fiscal registration capabilities, the fiscal integration framework, to support these requirements of Saudi Arabia, and any fiscal integration functionality that is developed based on the fiscal integration framework in commerce consists of two major parts. The first part is a fiscal document provider, which is an extension that basically is responsible for extracting the retail sales transaction data from the channel database and transforming this data into the form of a fiscal document, which is in most cases some text document that contains the retail transaction data that needs to be registered, right? And the second part of a fiscal integration functionality is the so-called fiscal connector, which is also an extension. It's a piece of code that is responsible for the submission of the fiscal document to in a way that is supported for a particular country, in a particular functionality. It can be a connector to a fiscal printer, or a connector to a web service, or, such as in the case of Saudi Arabia, it's just a piece of code that calculates the hash for the electronic invoice and digitally signs it. So in case of Saudi Arabia, the fiscal document provider actually calls the electronic reporting functionality that is integrated into commerce. So you may be familiar with the electronic reporting functionality that also exists for some time in Dynamics 365 family of applications. And this functionality is aimed to support various requirements on the generation of electronic files, electronic reports, such as like accounting or tax reporting in electronic format, or, for example, like electronic payments and so. So this functionality supports generation of such electronic documents using low-code, no-code capabilities, basically configurations that handle the generation of electronic documents, right? This functionality existed for some time in Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations applications and was recently integrated into Commerce. So we have the electronic reporting runtime on the Commerce channel side now, so we can use electronic reporting configurations to generate electronic reporting documents on the Commerce side. So the fiscal document provider for Saudi Arabia basically calls the electronic reporting runtime and uses some configurations to generate the electronic invoice or simplified electronic invoice in the XML format. And then this simplified electronic invoice is passed to the fiscal connector for Saudi Arabia, which is again a piece of code that calculates the hash, right? That generates the QR code that applies the digital certificate to digitally sign the electronic invoice data. And it's also important that the digital certificate that is used for digital signing is stored in the Azure in an Azure Key Vault storage. This is our common approach currently in Dynamics 365 to use certificates. Whenever it is required to use a digital certificate, the certificate must be stored in Key Vault and accessed through Key Vault. So we do it from Commerce as well, right? And then when the hash is calculated and QR code is generated and the digital signature is generated, this data is passed back to POS and then to the fiscal document provider, where it is saved to the database in the form of a so-called fiscal transaction linked to the retail transaction, right? And also after that, the regular receipt printing functionality of Commerce is run, and the regular sales receipt is printed, but this receipt can contain a QR code. The QR code that was generated for this electronic invoice. So this is basically on the high level the part of the process, electronic invoicing process for Commerce that is related to the generation of electronic invoicing. Okay, so let's have our first part of the demo. I will switch to the virtual machine, or to my demo machine, where I have both Commerce headquarters and POS or channel installed. And I also have an environment where the electronic invoicing is deployed and run, so I can demonstrate the end-to-end process of the generation and submission of simplified invoices in Commerce. So let's first look at some most important settings that must be made in the product in order to use the electronic invoicing for Commerce. So first, let's see the features that must be enabled in the feature management workspace in order to use this functionality. So basically, there are two electronic invoicing features for Commerce for Saudi Arabia. So we can search for them. Yeah, so the first one is this Saudi Arabia electronic invoicing integration, which is a general feature that enables electronic invoicing service integration in Dynamics 365 Finance, Supply Chain Management, Project Operations, and Commerce, right? And the second feature is this KSA electronic invoicing capability for the fiscal integration framework, which is an extension of the above feature, and it enables generation of simplified e-invoices on the retail channel side, and further processing of such simplified e-invoices. Right, so you need to enable these two features in order to use the e-invoicing functionality in commerce for Saudi Arabia. Right, then you also need to configure a so-called fiscal registration process, which basically combines all the settings that are required to use the fiscal integration framework. I will not dig deeply into these settings because they are quite extensive, but you can find all the information about how this is to be configured in our documentation on the learn.microsoft.com portal. Right. After configuring the fiscal registration process, you need to specify this fiscal registration process in the functionality profile. In the functionality profile, which is assigned to your POS registers, right? So in the POS functionality profile, we have this fiscal registration process tab where you specify the configured registration process, and also in the Saudi Arabia case, you need to specify a fiscal service, which is basically the part of the functionality related to the digital signing specifically, to the fiscal connector specifically. And as part of this configuration, you also need to configure the so-called certificate profile, which is the configuration of the digital certificate that needs to be that must be used when digitally signing simplified electronic invoices on the commerce side. So if we look at those, if you look at the certificate profile, we can see that it actually contains settings for the certificates that may be used for digital signing. Right, and you can see that it's possible to add multiple certificates here, and these certificates can be stored either in Key Vault or locally. Right, this is needed to support various fallback strategies that you may have in your application. For example, you of course can store your digital certificate that is used for digital signing in a Key Vault storage, right? And whenever a sales transaction is completed in POS, it will request this digital certificate from Key Vault, get it, and used for signing. But if POS is, for example, is in the offline mode, that is, it doesn't have any connectivity to headquarters or commerce scale unit, it will not be able to request it. But in this case, it can fall back to a local certificate, to a certificate that is installed locally on the machine where the modern POS is run, right? So this functionality enables configuring such fallback strategies. Now, for the demo purposes, I'm using a locally installed certificate, right? But it can also access Key Vault in case the local certificate is not available. So when this is configured, this is specified for the fiscal registration process itself. Okay, and next important part of the settings is like electronic reporting configurations to be used when generating a simplified electronic invoice on the commerce channel side. You need to import those electronic reporting configurations, and the process is also, again, is described in our documentation. So in order to be able to generate electronic invoices in the commerce, you need to import the invoicing model configuration, and then you need to import the invoice model mapping for commerce configuration, and you need to import the sales invoice for Saudi Arabia configuration, right? So two of these configurations are common for commerce and finance, and they are used also on the electronic invoicing side to generate. I mean, on the electronic invoicing service side to generate electronic invoices. So for regular tax invoices coming from commerce or supply chain management and so on, right? And only the invoice model mapping for commerce configuration is specific to commerce because it maps the electronic invoice format, or sorry, the electronic invoice, I would say, data to the real data model of commerce, to the data model that consists of retail transactions and fiscal transactions linked to them, right? And one more important part that you need to take care of when setting up your environment for electronic invoicing in commerce is the like receipt formats. So as I said, it's required to configure receipt formats and add a QR code to those receipts formats. And we implemented the QR code in the form of a custom field. So if you open the custom fields page, you can see that there is this invoice QR code _SA custom field configured that basically prints the QR code generated for a simplified invoice on the channel side. And this custom field then can be added to the receipt format or formats that you use, right? So you can see this QR code field here. Okay, let's see how it looks like on the POS side. I mean, the generation of simplified e-invoices. And it's not a surprise that actually the cashier or the regular operator just cannot see any difference when the simplified invoicing is enabled for commerce. Actually, a regular sales process happens, right? So the cashier can start a transaction, can add an item to the transaction, can add another item to the transaction, right? Then can register a payment for the sale, right? And the transaction is basically concluded, and the regular receipt is printed, right? And only at that moment you can see some difference from just from the core or standard sales process, and this difference is in the receipt that is printed for the sales transaction. So I configured printing receipts to files here in this environment so that we could check the receipts, right? So this is the receipt which is printed for our transaction completed recently, and you can see that the QR code is printed in this receipt, right? So this is the only difference that is noticeable for cashiers. Everything else happens behind the scene, so no user process actually is changed with this electronic invoicing. But let's see how it looks like from the data perspective. So let's actually upload the transaction data to headquarters. We use the regular distribution schedule functionality, and we run the P job here, right? So while it runs, I will remind you that the electronic invoice data coming from commerce together with the hash code and QR code is saved in so-called fiscal transactions that are linked to retail transactions, and they uploaded to headquarters using like regular P job, regular sync job. So let's check whether the job is completed. Yes, we can see that the job has just been completed. Let's open the store transaction page. Let's look at our transaction, like posted recently. I think this should be this one, right? And we can see that there is a fiscal transaction tab here in the store transactions form, and here there is a fiscal transaction linked to the store transaction, and it contains the so-called fiscal register response, which is basically some text that contains all the information that is returned by the fiscal integration functionality, including the XML file generated for the e-invoice and also its hash and QR code, right? And if you click this extended data button, you can also see this information parsed into separate elements, such as the QR code, the submitted document, which is basically the XML, and hash of this electronic invoice, right? So this data comes to Commerce headquarters in the form of physical transactions, a link to retail transactions. Okay, let's switch back to our presentation. And let's briefly talk about electronic invoice submission for commerce, right? So as I mentioned multiple times previously, the submission part of the process is handled by the electronic invoicing service, which is like an offering, Microsoft offering that basically extends the electronic invoicing capabilities of Dynamics 365 family of products and provides a unified integrated electronic invoicing experience in those products. And this service, I will not talk much about it because it's covered in other sessions that we provided earlier. But just major advantages of using this service are its like simplified extensibility. The functionality is fully configurable. This means that developing a new electronic invoicing integration or customizing an existing electronic invoicing integration doesn't require coding. It just requires modifying or creating new configurations or modifying existing configuration. Right, so this extensibility is like quite simple here, and also this service provides consistency across electronic invoicing implementation in various countries. So the same functionality, same approach is used for various countries or regions, right? And also both Microsoft and our customers and partners can have consistent approach to implementing electronic invoicing requirements. And also it supports a richer functionality out of box. We support multiple import and export formats of electronic invoices. It's like much more much broader scope of electronic invoicing requirements are supported out of the box in the product, right? So like using electronic invoicing service requires like some configuration. So you need to use our regulatory configuration services in order to configure electronic invoicing features. You also need to use the like Key Vault, Azure Key Vault and Azure Storage Account to store digital certificates and electronic invoices respectively. You need to use our global repository of configurations in order to obtain the electronic invoicing configurations required to generate electronic invoices. So using this requires quite a bit of administration and configuration, right? But on the other hand, for users, for end users who are expected to post invoices and then submit them, this brings like just very simple experience. Basically, users, as I demonstrated on the commerce example, users basically do not see anything here. Users just perform their regular job. They post invoices, they create sales transactions in POS and so on. And behind the scene, this electronic invoicing functionality runs. It uses the configurations that are created and stored in the depositories, right, in order to extract the invoice data from applications, send them to the electronic invoicing service, transform them into the form of electronic invoices, and submit them to various recipients, such as like government web services or so, right? So this schema is basically the same for all Dynamics 365 products, such as finance, supply chain management, project operations and commerce, as I said, right? And one more important part of the electronic invoicing process for Saudi Arabia specifically is the so-called onboarding process, right? And this onboarding process ensures that the organization that needs to issue electronic invoices has required access and can issue and submit electronic invoices and submit them to the government for clearance and then send to their customers. This onboarding process requires in advance that the organization is a registered taxpayer in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, right, and has a VAT number, and also the organization must have the access to the government's electronic filing portal, right, and in order to onboard for using electronic invoicing in Saudi Arabia, the organization must request the portal to generate a so-called one-time password. Right, then when this password is obtained, they need to request a so-called compliance cryptographic step identifier from the portal, again using some API or user interface of the portal, right? And this cryptographic stamp identifier is basically the digital certificate that needs to be used for digital signing and for digital signing of invoices and authentication on the government portal. Right, and first they obtain this so-called compliance CSID, right, which is a temporary certificate, which is used for compliance check, right? And compliance check is basically the verification from the authority side of test electronic invoice sent by the issuer, so that just the portal or authorities verify that your system that is trying to connect to this electronic invoicing portal can issue compliant electronic invoices, right? So you obtain this CCSID, compliance cryptographic stamp identifier, you generate a test electronic invoice and send it for compliance check to authorities, right? And if it passes the compliance check, you can get an approval. You can then request a so-called production cryptographic step identifier, which is basically the digital certificate that you will use in production for the generation and digital signing of electronic invoicing and then authenticating with the government portal. All right. So this is the general onboarding process. But in case of commerce, there is one important change or difference here, right? Because each point of sale is considered by the authorities as a separate so-called electronic invoicing generation unit, you need to obtain as many production cryptographic stamp identifiers as you have POS registers. This means that if you have like 10 stores and 3 POS registers each, right, you will have like 30 POS registers in total, and you will have to obtain 30 PCS IDs for these, right? And you will have to complete this onboarding process for these registers, right? We have some kind of semi-automation in our product to support obtaining these CSIDs in the form of some scripts, right? But anyway, this may be kind of an effort to obtain these identifiers and then to set up them in the system, right? Okay, let's switch to the second part of the demo. Again, I'm going to my environment. And first, we need to configure the electronic invoicing on the regulatory configuration service environment that you must have here. So we have so-called globalization features or electronic invoicing features specifically configured here. So again, to learn more about this functionality, please review our other TechTalk sessions on electronic invoicing and our documentation, right? So in case of commerce, we have, as I mentioned, one important difference in this setup, and this difference is that we need to configure as many like feature setups as we have POS registers in our retail chain, right? So if we just look at the feature setup for electronic invoicing for commerce, we can see that this feature setup contains the information about the digital certificate, right? In this integrate with Saudi Arabia Zatka step, there is a parameter certificate name and also parameter secret name, which basically indicates the digital certificate used for the signing and authentication purposes, right? And as I mentioned, you need to have like as many certificates, as many CSIDs as you have POS registers. So you need to configure as many feature version setups as you have POS registers, right? Also, in the feature version setup, you need to configure applicability rules so that this feature setup is applicable only for one POS register. So basically, you have this applicability rule pointing to a register number. In my case, it's Houston 18. This is the POS that I'm using for demo purposes, right? And as I said, there is a digital certificate that is basically linked to this POS register, right? And so when you configure your electronic invoicing feature, you have to create as many feature setups as you have POS registers, right? So you can see here I have two feature setups for Houston 16 and Houston 18, and they have different applicability rule and digital certificate settings, right? Okay, so on the commerce headquarters side, in order to use a submission of electronic invoices, you need to configure electronic reporting configurations that are used to extract retail transaction data from commerce headquarters and send them to the electronic invoicing service. These again are configured in this electronic reporting configurations page. So basically, you need to import this customer invoice context model configuration and also retail fiscal document mapping and retail fiscal document format configuration. So these are commerce-specific configurations that are used to extract a simplified electronic invoice data from commerce headquarters database, right, and send it to the electronic invoicing service so that it could submit this data to authorities, right? So how the submission itself looks like, it's very simple. There is a job named submit electronic documents. It's very simple. It uses some settings that define which electronic invoicing documents are to be extracted and sent, right? So it's only needed to run this job, and it can be run, of course, in the batch mode, right? And it basically extracts the data of electronic invoices from commerce headquarters and send the data to the electronic invoicing service. We can see that one document was submitted, and actually it's basically the transaction that we completed in the first part of the demo. And we can look at the electronic document submission log page, where we have all the documents that were submitted to the electronic invoicing service. And this is the last one is our transaction here. If we check the submission details, we can see that the submission was successful. The 3 steps were made, and the last step has this message that the validation was successfully completed for this invoice type. So basically, we completed the end-to-end process for electronic invoicing for commerce, right? So we registered a sales transaction in POS, an electronic invoice was generated, hashed, signed, and the QR code was printed, and then the data of this invoice was uploaded to Commerce headquarters, and then in the end submitted to authorities through the electronic invoicing service. So this completes the end-to-end process for Commerce. Okay, so back to the presentation. I have only a couple of slides left. So just to summarize the specific differences that electronic invoicing implementation has in Commerce as compared to finance, right? I mentioned these during my presentation. So again, we have to download ER configurations, electronic reporting configurations, to our Commerce headquarters to import these configurations to be able to generate electronic invoices on the Commerce channel side. So compared to finance, where you don't need to import those configurations to your finance environment, because the generation of electronic invoices happens on the electronic invoicing service side, right? Also, separate electronic reporting configurations are created to support the submission part of the process, basically to extract retail transaction data from the database and send them to the service for submission. A separate globalization feature must be configured in your RCS environment for Commerce. So you need to configure this. For Commerce specifically, you need to import Commerce-specific electronic invoicing feature by Microsoft, and you need to also to set it up using the real PCS IDs that you get from the government for each your POS register, right? And then also you need, as I mentioned, you need to configure as many feature setups for your electronic invoicing feature, or as we call it, electronic invoicing pipelines, as you have POS registers. Okay, the last slide, my slide is just summarizing all the resources that we currently have that you can review to learn more about electronic invoicing implementation in Dynamics 365 in general, and for Saudi Arabia specifically. There is this TechTalk series, electronic invoicing, that includes all TechTalk sessions conducted on electronic invoicing, and also quite an extensive documentation on the learn.microsoft.com portal related to electronic invoicing, electronic reporting, and the Commerce implementation. If you have any questions, you can contact us later using the this email, right? And also you can join the Yammer group to ask the questions on electronic invoicing as well. So this is it from my side. This is the end of my presentation, and I can switch to the question and answer section. We have several minutes to probably try to respond to as many questions as we have. So Marek, I don't know if you can summarize some questions that we have in Q&A.
Of course. Thank you very much, Evgeny, first of all, for very informative presentation. So in the meantime, I would also encourage all the participants to submit questions through Q&A panel. Those which we have received, we partially answered, and the rest is already published and available for everyone to see. So we've got several questions, I would say more generic, related to electronic invoicing service, and there are a few very specific to Commerce or POS. So I will start with answering or summarizing those general questions, and afterwards I will ask you, Evgeny, to address those few which we have for Commerce. So the first one, can you summarize today's availability for invoicing service and invoice solutions that you have, how it looks in comparison to finance and operations? So in general, we provide out of the box 20 formats, 19 country specific, PEPL, many of those with integrations with incoming vendor invoice import, and so on. So in general, the availability of electronic invoicing service and solution is exactly in parity with Dynamics 365 enterprise applications like finance, supply chain, and etc. So what I wanted to say that even if there is no out-of-the-box country-specific invoicing solution available for a particular country, it's still possible to use like electronic invoicing service and its capabilities to configure it and cover. Like if not with integration, definitely with all the transformation rules. There was a question regarding documentation. So I believe that Evgeny included in the presentation all the most important the articles, links to most important articles, but I also include here, right, all those articles which are specific for Saudi Arabia. So we have plenty of documentation for electronic invoicing service and country-specific solutions. So I will encourage everyone to start looking into that from the overview of electronic invoicing service and the whole section below. So there are a few questions from. Okay, so another one. Does everybody in Saudi Arabia have to start using invoicing service from 1st of January to 2023, as it was with phase one last year? So no, as of today, all the taxpayers basically were enforced to comply with phase one requirements as of December 4th last year. And the requirement was to generate and store tax invoices in structured in electronic form. So now for phase two integration, which is being rolled out in waves, the actual enforcement will depend on the group to whom you will belong as a taxpayer. So Zatka announced last summer that the first wave started 1st of January with a certain limit of the turnover last year, and they said that they will be announcing, contacting and notifying all the taxpayers per their applicable wave, at least with 6 months advance. Okay. So another question, whether it is possible to use electronic invoicing for normal sales order invoice, since retail model is not in use, of course. So this session was devoted to commerce and generation and submission in the reporting mode of invoicing coming from POS, but all the requirements are also addressed, and the update is available for the client side for the Dynamics 365 Finance to cover sales order, FTI, free text invoice, and project invoices to be submitted in the same way, both like with the regular tax invoice and in specific cases with simplified invoices as well. So all those capabilities are available. And with that, I think, Evgeny, that I had addressed all those questions which were more related to generic aspects. Yeah, so I would like to ask you to address those retail specific. So I can read those for you for your convenience, if you wish.
No problem, Marek. I will read it out myself. So actually, we have like a couple of minutes, so we probably are able to cover 2-3 questions. So the first one is like how e-invoice generation and submission look like when MPOS is offline. I believe I touched it a bit during my presentation. So in brief, like there is no difference whether modern POS is online or offline. I mean that it's possible to generate and digitally sign an invoice and print the QR code in the offline mode. We just don't use the certificate for signing that is stored in Key Vault, but we rather use a certificate that is stored in the local certificate storage on the machine that the MPOS is run on. Right. Otherwise, everything else looks exactly the same. And when the electronic invoice is generated and signed, this data is stored in the offline database, and then the online is restored, the information is synchronized to the channel database and then goes to the headquarters and submitted to authorities in exactly the same way. Okay, the next question is if we support printing QR codes by Opos or Windows drivers. Yeah, for this we have some complexity here because of the variety of printers receipt printers that can be used by our customers, both like Windows printers or Opos printers. We do support printing receipts, QR codes and receipts for Windows printers and some Opos printers. But in general, the answer is that you may need to somehow customize a bit the printing capability in order to be able to print QR codes using your specific devices. And we have some guidelines for this. You can connect our support channel to get these guidelines. Okay, the next question would be, while transferring the fiscal transactions to HQ, if it's a nightly batch job and the date changes, how the transactions are imported with reference of system date or the date on which the transactions were posted. I take this question as so that I believe I also partly responded to that. Fiscal transactions are being transferred to headquarters together with retail transactions. So this probably can be a job that runs every whatever minutes you want, right? As many retailers do, they just configure those P jobs running like once at 10 minutes or once 5 minutes, so that they quickly get the information about the sales from their channels to the headquarters, right? So all this data comes really quickly to headquarters, can come quickly to headquarters, and then there must be a separate job to submit those transactions to authorities through the invoicing service. And this job can be configured to run nightly or once an hour or with any frequency that you need, right? So you are only required to submit those electronic invoices to the government during like 24 hours after completing the transaction, right? So you need to make sure you configure your batches to run as frequently as you need to be able to submit electronic invoices on the timely manner, right? Okay. When enabling the two required features, is there any retail seat data added, modified? So yeah. Retail seat data is modified in order to support actually the fiscal integration in general, right? Because the electronic invoice data is transferred in the form of fiscal transactions, right? And that's why there is no modification of retail seat data for Saudi Arabia invoicing specifically, but it's the modification for fiscal integration in general, for the fiscal integration framework in general. It was made quite some time ago, right? So there is no like Saudi Arabia specific modification of retail seat data, right? On the one hand, but on the other hand, it still differs from the standard retail seat data because we transfer like fiscal transactions. Okay. Well, I think I would say that we are already out of time, so probably we need to stop at the moment with the questions. But as I mentioned, you can contact us through our email address or send your questions to the Yammer group so that we could respond them and discuss in more details the implementation of electronic invoicing requirements. So with that, I pass the floor to Anthony to wrap up the session. Thanks everybody for attending this, and have a nice day. Yes. Anthony, over to you.
I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We'd love your feedback today on today's. We'd love your feedback on today's session and to hear what you'd like to see in future events. Thank you so much for your participation. As a reminder, the recording for today's session will be available on the TechTalks Community Dynamics page within the coming weeks. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and audience for joining us today.